third and final part of a British medical journal investigation has been published, debunking research by Andrew Wakefield, which claimed a link between autism and the MMR vaccine given to children. The journal denounces the study as an elaborate fraud, but Wakefield says it's trying to crush valid probes into immunisation. Wakefield's research led many parents to stop vaccinating their children and is still cited by anti-vaccination groups around the world. Dr. Rachel Dunlop is a research scientist and a member of the Australian Skeptics. She has written extensively about the Wakefield case on her blog and she joins us now. Rachel, thanks for coming on The Drum.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Now, let's go back to the case of Andrew Wakefield. What did he do? When did this all start? Before we get into the medical journal publications, tell us a bit more about Wakefield.
Sure. Well, the paper was published in 1998 in The Lancet and it covered 12 children who Wakefield was trying to demonstrate this new disorder called autistic colitis, which is a disease of the gastrointestinal tract. And so he did this study looking at these 12 children, and then what happened was, in fact, in the study, it didn't look at a link between autism and vaccination. But he had a subsequent press conference after the study was released, and this is where the whole sort of vaccines and MMR cause autism began. And it sort of got taken on by the media, particularly in the UK, and spread across the world. And it created this vaccine scare, which we still have today, which is that many parents think the vaccines
So what
autism.
direct influence did Wakefield have on childhood vaccinations?
Well, vaccination rates dropped, particularly the MMR, which is the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. In the UK, for example, after his study was released, levels dropped to about 79%. Now, it's required about 92% of people have to be vaccinated to have this process called herd immunity. And basically that means that if a lot of people in the community are vaccinated, then when we get viruses or bacteria into the community, they can't spread. And in some parts of London, in fact, vaccination levels dropped to as low as 50%. So,
of course, what impact did that have on these kind of diseases coming back into the
Well,
community?
it had an impact on measles coming back in the UK in particular, and children getting sick and some children tragically dying as a result. So, yeah, he had a big impact on the levels of vaccination rates after he released this paper.
Well, let's deal with the three-part series that the British Medical Journal has just released, and the last version of that has just been published. Now, They say that Wakefield is guilty of an elaborate fraud. Now, that's just not, making mistakes. Elaborate fraud is very strong language. Why are they using that kind of language?
Yeah, well, I guess before these three publications were put out by the BMJ, which was in the last sort of week and a half, we thought that perhaps it was bad science, whereby perhaps Wakefield had massaged the statistics a little bit or misinterpreted the data a little bit. But the research that Brian Deer did, and he's an investigative journalist who published these three things in the BMJ, he spent 7 years researching this case, and he was able to show that, in fact, Wakefield made up clinical records of the children in the study.
Those 12 children that you mentioned before.
That's correct. So the 12 children in that study, when Deer went back and checked the records at the hospital where they originally came and were diagnosed or tested on, didn't match the information that was in the paper whatsoever. It turned out also that most of the children that Wakefield said were autistic that he studied in this paper weren't autistic. It turned out that some of the studies that he did some pathology studies where he took tissue from the kids' colons to look for increased levels of measles virus. Those slides could never be found, so that data couldn't be reproduced. And of course, there's always something behind this stuff, Steve, and that's, he was in it for money, basically. So
tell us about that. Tell us what the Brian Deer, the journalist, found out about Wakefield's financial incentive to write what he did.
Well, I mean, I'm a research scientist myself, and when I read this stuff last week, I didn't think it could be as bad as it is. It's really, really bad. I mean, we knew that Wakefield was employed by a lawyer back in 1998, and this lawyer was putting together a case to show that the MMR vaccine was dangerous. And so Wakefield was being paid 150 quid an hour by these lawyers as an expert. And
didn't he end up getting over 400,000 British pounds from this legal firm?
Yeah, and I did a conversion today, and that comes to 696,000 Australian dollars. So it's not small bickies. In addition to that, he had a patent when he'd submitted for a measles vaccine, because what he was trying to show was that the triple injection was dangerous. So if he could show that through this paper, and he had a patent on a singles measles vaccine, then he could say, but I've got the solution over here. Here is the single one, buy mine. But in fact, that's we're talking about $1 million there, Steve, but it's much, much worse than that. And what Deere was able to find, which is what he published last week, was that also Wakefield had plans. He had a business plan to develop a test to look for this disorder in children. Now, this test was potentially going to be making his company about £72 million a year.
That is extraordinary.
So we're not talking small bickies here.
Okay, well, Anderson Cooper did an interview with Andrew Wakefield recently on CNN, and here is what Andrew Wakefield said in defence of himself after the first couple of the articles were published by the British Medical Journal.
This is a ruthless, pragmatic attempt to crush any investigation into valid vaccine safety concerns. Not just my concerns. I'm here at a meeting of experts on vaccines from around the world who are extremely concerned about the safety of vaccines and the damage that they believe and I believe is being done to children.
So Wakefield there is trying to say that the journal, the British Medical Journal, is trying to crush valid investigations into vaccines. He also said in that interview that the journalist Brian Deere is a hitman. He described him as a hitman.
Yeah, well, Wakefield's saying that this is an attempt to quash valid research into vaccines is absolutely false. For 13 years now, science has been concentrating on trying to find this link between vaccines and autism because Wakefield published this in 1998. So 13 years of science have been spent looking into this link. Lots and lots of studies have been done and there's been no evidence found, Steve. So in fact, we've diverted our attention from looking at the causes of autism into debunking what Wakefield did.
Okay, I want to ask this question in relation to that because the Australian Vaccination Network, who are an anti-vaccination organisation, they have a website. On their website, they refer to Wakefield and the British Medical Journal articles, and they say that Wakefield's results have been verified and re-verified many times in the years since that first study was published in 1998.
Yeah, this is something Wakefield says as well. He says that there have been 5 studies done internationally that repeated or reproduced his work. One of those studies was done by one of Wakefield's colleagues and published in a journal on which Wakefield was an editor. So there's a big conflict of interest there as to whether or not, that's a valid study. One of them was an abstract, which means it was presented at a conference but never published. A couple of them were case studies on 1 or 2 people, and one of them did a reasonable study and showed that there was no link. So I'm not quite sure where they get that information from.
Okay, the AVN also say, once again, the media, in response to these BMJ articles, once again, the media is marching to the tune of their advertisers and goose-stepping across the truth without any regard to what actually happened.
Well, if you look at the studies that have been done since Wakefield published the Lancet paper, for example, there was a study done in Denmark that looked at about 500,000 children and looked at vaccinated versus unvaccinated and found there was no increase in MMR. In Japan, they stopped using the MMR for a long time and the rates of autism continued to increase. Some of the components of vaccines that people like the AVN claim cause autism were taken out of vaccines in the year 2000, 2001, but autism rates continue to go up. So it's clear that it's nothing to do with the vaccination.
Tanvir, you got a question or a comment?
I guess I'm curious, just anecdotally as a doctor, I didn't see, certainly working in Sydney or out of Sydney, thankfully, as large as this was in Britain, I didn't get the impression that it had kind of spread to any lengths, at least in metropolitan Sydney. I know there are certainly sections of Australia, but I would be curious to know about statistics. Was there any drop in vaccination rates in Australia?
Not really. It didn't affect Australia as much as it did the UK. I mean, we only have about 2 or 3% of parents in this country that refuse to vaccinate altogether. It's quite a small number. It hasn't changed much. So it really was a big problem, much more in the United States and also in the UK. Yeah.
I mean, my I guess comment on this is a couple of things. One, I think there is a segment of the community generally that would be suspicious of science, modern medicine, etc. Would look towards, hence the rise in alternative medicine, secular spiritualities. So this sort of information would be particularly attractive to that group. Second, these sort of events, it demeans the quality of science to the public who already have a very poor understanding of science. And, climate change is a great example. So increasingly people will question just the validity of trials in general. So I think it's very damaging, this caper for scientific discourse in the public realm.
Kerry?
I've just got a comment, and that is, as the mother of a child who was vaccinated, but who still got measles, my only comment is that the doctors said to me, see how sick she is. Can you imagine how much sicker she would have been if she hadn't been vaccinated? So I actually don't understand why anyone wouldn't vaccinate their children. I just think it's one of these things which we are, as parents, we should all be doing. And I think, you know, the fact that kids who get measles get as sick as they do, and they can die. I just think it's an obligation on every responsible parent to vaccinate their kids. And I don't know anything about the science. I just know how sick Lisa was.
In the history of healthcare, clean water and vaccinations are probably two of the biggest things that have saved lives.
Well, just finally today on The Drum, British MPs have been banned from using Twitter while sitting in the House of Commons. The Deputy Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, made the ruling after a Labor politician complained about a Liberal Democrat tweeting during a debate, instead of giving his arguments on the floor of the Parliament. Now, the ban comes just a month after a landmark decision allowing reporters to tweet from courtrooms in England and Wales. Latika, what's the situation in the Australian Federal Parliament like at the moment when it comes to tweeting?
Well, there's been some great incidents where particularly opposition MPs have tweeted from the floor in question time. Usually they're discussed with the Prime Minister at the time because, hey, there's been a couple. And the Speaker of the House, Harry Jenkins, has actually had to rule on whether this is parliamentary behaviour or not. Now, for the moment, it has been deemed so. But a lot of MPs that I speak to actually self-censor and they don't believe that it is parliamentary conduct to tweet from the chamber. And a lot of government MPs actually refrain from doing so. But a lot of the opposition ones really like it because they feel that they get such a hard run in question time from the government appointed speaker that it gives them a voice to complain and protest about some of the rulings. And it's pretty fun when you're up there and then you see them tapping out these angry messages.
Who does it,
you
Latika?
see them 2 seconds later.
Who in the opposition does it a lot?
Joe Hockey's pretty good. He'll send off a fiery one now and then. Peter Dutton used to send a couple. They weren't too bad. A couple of the backbenchers, Stuart Robert, will send some funny ones on occasion at times too. But during the Rudd days, you would just get stream after stream of tweets from Bob Baldwin, MP, the Liberal frontbencher. You know,
there were some pretty long speeches going on in that era.
Very bored with Rudd.
Well, it kind of confirms what I've always thought it must be. I think the tweeting in Parliament by opposition members is the equivalent of the Mexican wave at the cricket.
It is.
When you're bored out of your mind with what's happening on the floor, you decide that you're going to
It's a lot more subtle. Like I find it quite useful. I guess it's sort of organisational risk management. That's the way I see it, because increasingly you're seeing all these people kind of just, you know, get themselves in a whole heap, a big mess after tweeting and not really knowing how to tweet. So I think that's the way
there's some folks who are pretty good at it, and I'm sure
that's the way I interpret it. I don't think it'll
Rachel,
last.
you won an international award for your tweeting.
I did.
What do you think of this?
Well, I've been watching K-Rod actually tweet during the floods, and he's been really interesting to follow. And you mentioned earlier the Queensland Police Media Service, who are fantastic. I don't think there's anything wrong with politicians tweeting from the floor. I'm happy to see their stuff, you know.
I think the bloke in the UK must have been concerned that somebody was actually sending on Twitter to the guy who was tweeting the best interjections to use against him. I think that's what he was really worried about.
Well, that's it for The Drum for today. Thanks to our panel, Kerry Tanvir, Latika and Rachel Dunlop. You can check out our website at abc.net.au/The Drum. We'll see you next time.